以为台海爆发危机，美国必会强势介入。听完新加坡外交官马凯硕在 CNN 的舌战，你会发现封锁台海根本不用开枪，而西方连打破封锁的勇气都没有。
This week, after Xi Jinping welcomed Russian President Vladimir Putin to Beijing, the Chinese leader said his country's relationship with Russia had reached, quote, the highest level in history, unquote. Their meeting came only a few days after a high-stakes visit from President Trump to China. I'm joined by Richard Haass, former top State Department official, President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, and the writer of a great Substack, as well as Kishore Mahbubani, who is a veteran Singaporean diplomat and a distinguished fellow at the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. Richard, we now have a kind of interesting dynamic between these three great powers in the world, where everyone's getting on a little bit better, I suppose, but the Russians and Chinese do seem to have formed a kind of axis.
I'd call it an alignment. It's not quite an alliance. The last I checked, China's aid for Russia is, shall we say, finite. It's limited. It's also very much a relationship between unequals. That, to me, was the lead part of Mr. Putin's visit, which is how much he's become almost a supplicant, pushing China to open up this new pipeline, almost more for Russia's economic benefit than for China's. So I don't think it's all that significant. It also highlights the difference. China's a multifaceted major power. Yeah. Russia's pretty limited, pretty one-dimensional. And by the way, the last I checked, it's not winning its war of choice against Ukraine, and it's paying an enormous price for it. So Russia's going to emerge much weaker as a result of what it's doing.
You made this point, Richard, in I think on X, that Russia and the United States are both, went to China, and in similar circumstances, they are both losing their wars of choice, one in Ukraine, one in Iran.
Yeah, for all the differences between the wars, that's the bottom line. They're both going to emerge worse off as a result. The really interesting point for me, Fareed, just the way Kishore thinks, is what message China takes from that. And when Xi Jinping sees this, does he say, maybe these wars aren't so obvious. They don't turn out the way you think. So I'm hoping this might be a moment of some sobriety, if you will, for Xi Jinping.
Kishore, how do you think Xi Jinping is looking at these two wars of choice where the United States and Russia are both floundering?
Well, I think from China's point of view, in many ways, things couldn't be better now. Because the United States very clearly now is stuck in the Gulf. And so in that every war that the United States fights in the Middle East is a gift to China, because it buys time for China to keep growing its economy and to become stronger. And at the end of the day, the Chinese are always playing the long game. They're trying to figure out where they'll be 10 years from now as a result of the current developments.
But when you look at, when they look at how difficult these wars have been, despite Russia's massive asymmetrical advantage, and is much bigger than Ukraine, the US is much bigger than Iran, do you think they look at that and draw a cautionary lesson about Taiwan?
Well, the way the Western media describes Taiwan is absolutely wrong. And I say this because everybody thinks that China is just preparing to try and invade Taiwan militarily as quickly as possible, and then seeing whether or not the examples of Iran and Ukraine will apply to Taiwan. And here again, I must emphasize that the Chinese take a very comprehensive long-term view and ask a very simple question. On whose side is time on? Is time on Taiwan's side, or is time on China's side? And trust me, if the Taiwanese declare independence tomorrow, which is what will cause a war, how many countries are going to recognize Taiwan? When I was in Taiwan a few months ago, I told the Taiwanese people, you're lucky you have a Republic of China passport, which brings you to over 180, 190 countries. You change your passport to Republic of Taiwan, you'll be lucky if 5 or 6 countries recognize the Republic of Taiwan passport. So time is on China's side on Taiwan, Obviously, they're going to emphasize that the power they're accumulating is on their favor. They're going to show signals of strength, but they're not in any way dreaming of a military invasion of Taiwan anytime soon.
Richard, we were talking about who has the advantage in terms of time, China or Taiwan? Whose side is time on? And Kishore makes the point, of course, on China's, they're the bigger economy. They will get larger and larger over time. That's clearly the Beijing strategy. Do you agree?
I actually don't. China right now is what, 1.3 billion people? By the end of the century, it's projected to be closer to 800 million. The ratio of working age people to people who are elderly is going to move much in the direction of the latter, of the elderly. Defense technology is increasingly through drones and anti-ship and anti-aircraft systems moving in favor of defenders. So I actually think that could help Taiwan if they adapt that. The key variable, I think, is the United States. I actually agree with Kishore to a bit. China doesn't want to do an invasion. There's no Chinese soldier who's fought in a war. To do a combined arms
invasion. Since the Korean War, if you take Vietnam out of it, which was a very brief war.
And so they were basically all retired. So, I don't think what they want to do, almost in the principle of Sun Tzu, they want to subdue their enemy without having to fire a shot. Well, that puts a lot of pressure on us. So the real question coming out of the summit, in that interview that President Trump did with Bret Baier on Fox, is the United States prepared to trade off support for Taiwan for economic access to China's market? If he's willing to do that, then China might get its wish.
Kishore, I've always thought that the real thing deterring China is not the U.S. military, but it is the fear of losing access to the American market, the European market, the Japanese. China wants to sell to the world. It's integrated into the world economy. That's why I tend to agree with you. They're not going to willy-nilly invade Taiwan, but that's the deterrent, that more than the American military.
各位，这段话听着是不是觉得特别爽？但这绝不是一句简单的气话，这背后是极其冰冷的现实推演。你想想看啊，刚才视频里 CNN 的主持人和美国前高级外交官，他们满脑子想的都是什么？是导弹数量、兵力投送、抢滩登陆。在西方的传统阵营里，只要一提到台海，那剧本必定是好莱坞级别的血战。可马凯硕一句话，直接把这套剧本给撕了。你美国连在中东对付个拖鞋军，对付个伊朗支持的武装，都搞得焦头烂额。全球20%的经济命脉被人家卡着，你连个红海护航都搞不定。那如果是拥有世界第一大工业生产力，拥有绝对区域反制能力的中国，宣布对台湾进行全面海空封锁呢？你们敢动中国一根毛吗？这就扯开了西方媒体最怕面对的一个真相。一旦中国大陆划定禁区，西方没有任何一个政客敢下令让自己的舰队去硬闯，因为硬闯就意味着大国间的全面战争，而西方根本没有准备好，更没有意愿为了台湾去承受这种历史性的代价。更可怕的是，就像马凯硕在视频后半段提到的，中国早已通过极其庞大的产业链深度绑定了全球。西方想要制裁，对不起，中国制造已经是全世界的绝对必需品。但这还不是最让美国人绝望的。如果仅仅是军事上的拒止和经济上的捆绑，那还不足以解释为什么中国能保持现在的战略定力。中国为什么一点都不着急？为什么在西方媒体天天炒作武统时间表的时候，中国依然按部就班？要弄懂这个底层逻辑，我们必须把时间线拉回到这场交锋的开局。在长达近7分钟的铺垫里，马凯硕早就给美国人布下了一个战略死局。
The first point is this. What's the big lesson that Iran is teaching us in the Gulf? You don't need superior military weapons to seize control of a choke point, okay? You don't need the best military in the world. Iran doesn't have the best military in the world, and guess what? It's held up 20% of the world's economy. Now, in the case of Taiwan, all the Chinese have to do is to say Taiwan is off limits. Okay? Isolate, blockade Taiwan. They don't have to fire a shot. Trust me. Nobody's going to break a Chinese blockade on Taiwan. I mean, let's get serious about this area. If the Chinese declare that they are serious, people will take them seriously. That's my first point. And the second point, your point about selling goods to the world. You know, selling goods to the world is a two-way relationship. This is one statistic everyone should understand. China's share of global manufacturing in the year 2000 was 6%. Now it's close to 30%. By 2030, it'll be 45%. And you know what that means? Chinese products are becoming indispensable to the world. Absolutely indispensable. Now, the Chinese have created this dependence on China for a very powerful, deliberate reason to ensure that no American containment policy of China can succeed.
I have a short amount of time. You have a thought?
Well, China's also dependent on exports. China has not allowed domestic demand to grow naturally. They've repressed it. Why? So they've got this export-led economy. So they need access as much as we need their goods. So I think that's also a constraint on China.
Which is why I tend to think, I mean, I think Kishore is right. It's a two-way street, but
sure.
For both. And the real deterrent would be if the US and Europe and Japan and Australia would all come together and say, if you invade Taiwan, it won't be business as usual, which, by the way, we could do, except that we are quarreling with all our closest allies, levying tariffs on them and making, far from presenting a united front, we have worse relations with Canada now than we have with China.
That was the strategic argument for joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We could present a united front. This is the great strategic advantage of American foreign policy. We wake up in the morning, we have dozens of partners and allies. What have we done? We've undermined our own fundamental strategic advantage.
Kishore Mahbubani, Richard Haas, always a pleasure to talk to you guys.
你看，这就是顶级外交官看问题的视角。如果说前面的封锁论是战术上的底牌，那这段长达近7分钟交锋中透露出的时间论，就是中国战略上的阳谋。今天西方媒体天天在头条上炒作什么武统时间表，这纯粹是用他们海盗文明的急躁，去揣测一个拥有5000年历史、懂得下大棋的大国。马凯硕说的特别透彻，而且是用一种几乎在教导 CNN 主持人的语气说，时间在中国这边。这就形成了一个让西方极其难受的死局。第一，在法理上，台湾根本走不出所谓的独立这一步。换个护照，你能去的地方从180多个瞬间缩减到5、6个，这种国际空间的绝对压缩，不是喊2句民主口号就能填补的。第二，正如马凯硕所指出的，美国的每一场中东战争都是送给中国的礼物。因为这为中国赢得了发展经济的宝贵时间。第三，在军事地缘上，正如开局所说，西方根本没有意愿也没有能力去打破中国的海峡封锁。表面上看，这是一场关于台湾岛的电视辩论，但放到更大的结构里，这是西方旧有的霸权逻辑，在面对东方正在崛起的全维度体系优势时表现出的心虚与焦虑。他们急需在台海制造一个爆发点，来打断中国的发展节奏，但中国偏偏不随他们的剧本起舞。当你的对手不仅在战略上耗得起，在战术上还能随时让你付出无法承受的代价时，所有的威慑就变成了一场虚张声势的闹剧。所以下一次再看到西方政客拿台海问题大呼小叫，你只需要记住马凯硕那句轻描淡写的话，如果中国人说他们是认真的，那大家最好把他们当真。